Hello, you're welcome to a special edition of Straight Talk Africa, coming to you live from the School of Communication at American University here in Washington, D.C. I am Shaka Ssali, and today we will have a conversation on the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., an international civil rights and human rights icon who had a global vision for justice. Next Tuesday, August 28th, is the 55th anniversary of the March on Washington, a march that resonated with people around the globe, especially in Africa and the African diaspora. Dr. King developed a strong kinship with African leaders who were struggling against European colonial rule. Dr. King believed the struggle against colonialism, apartheid in South Africa, and racial injustice elsewhere, all were intertwined. Dr. King developed a strong kinship with African leaders who were pursuing independence from colonial rule. Dr. King believed the struggle against colonialism, apartheid, and racial injustice were all intertwined. One of his most famous quotes, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Joining me to discuss the legacy of the civil rights icon and international human rights leader are Robert Vinson, Associate Professor of History and Africana Studies at the College of William and Mary. He is the author of "The Americans Are Coming, Dreams of African Americans' Liberation in Segregationist South Africa." Dr. Sherry Williams, Assistant Professor, School of Communication, American University here in Washington, D.C., where she teaches classes examining the ways in which race, gender, and class are portrayed in the media. I gather that without Sherry, we wouldn't be here this afternoon. So thank you really so much. And I say this from the deepest, better part of the
I
bottom.
don't want to take responsibility for that. This is a great show and also a very worthy subject for us to discuss. So thank you for being here.
You're most welcome. The Reverend Aniedi Okule, he is the Executive Director, Africa Faith and Justice Network. And last but not least, Faustine Wabwire, Senior Manager for Policy and Advocacy at the Management Sciences for Health. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have to say frankly that I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host you on this special edition of Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you for having me.
You're most welcome. Now, I have to come to you really, Robert, because you come from here. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. means a lot of things to you and all of us, of course. But if I were to ask you to talk to me from the deepest, better part of the bottom of your American heart and soul, what really made or makes Dr. King tick?
Well, the first thing we should think about with Dr. King is, first and foremost, he saw himself as a Christian and as a minister, but also a political activist. And his Christianity and his sense of justice came together. He believed that Jesus was the champion of the oppressed, And he made connections between oppressed people in America, African Americans, and oppressed people all over the world, particularly in Africa and the Caribbean, and people of color elsewhere, like in India. So I think what made Dr. King tick was the sense of justice, racially, economically, and in every other forms. He was looking for equity. He was looking to build the beloved community.
Very interesting. What about you, Sherry?
I definitely agree with that assessment, and especially in terms of the beloved community. I think one thing that's really important about the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is that he was serious about making this a reality, not just in terms of these interpersonal communications that we have with one another, but in terms of institutional change. So when you talk about the 55th anniversary of the March on Washington, but it was the March on Washington for jobs and freedom not just to be able to have an opportunity to go where we wanted to go and to spend our money where we wanted to spend it, but also to have the freedom to be able to create our own jobs, to be able to have the kind of, to build the kind of wealth that would also lead to freedom and sustainability for communities of color across the country. So I think it's important to understand and to realize that he was not just wanting us to just come together and hold hands with one another. He really wanted us to be able to stand on an equal plane and equal platform together, and he knew that that had to happen through legislation and policy change.
What about you, Reverend Okole?
Yeah, I think as I look at Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I see somebody who merged, as he said, Christianity and a sense of social justice. You know, Dr. King was a minister. His interaction with the scriptures, his interaction with the Bible, you know, made him to understand the basic dignity of the human person. It made him to understand that that dignity was not given to the human being by the state or anybody else, but was endowed by God, the Creator. And so anything that deprives a person of that dignity needed to be fought against. And so in that context, he realized that to preserve that dignity, oppressed people have the right to resist so that they can restore their dignity. And so what really made him think was this combination of his Christian faith in terms of the dignity of the human person, in addition to the sense of justice. And that made him transcend the US, Africa, India, and everywhere where there is injustice and where the human lives are at stake.
What about you, Ms. Wawide?
Thank you. I think it's virtually impossible, like fellow panelists have said, to ignore the role of faith and how that shaped the person and the revolution that Dr. King continues to be. And I think because of his deep spiritual conviction that all people could share in the wealth of the earth, that all people could work toward a more just and equitable society, I think for me, he was responding to a higher calling that, like Reverend Aniedi says, transcended national frontiers. And because of that, it sort of birthed this transnational advocacy for justice, which is why we see his connections with countries across the continent of Africa as they fought for independence. But also, interestingly, to kind of think of how the struggle of independence out there bolstered his own belief in continuing to struggle right here in the US.
Very interesting. Robert, you obviously all talk about, you know, his values of Christianity and what have you. But when you look at the man himself and how he lived his life, he was a man, frankly, someone will tell you, had no boundaries, no borders when it came to sectarianism.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think he grew up in a household, first of all, that was deeply interested in international affairs, particularly African affairs. His father corresponded with African leaders, hosted African students in his house. So he grew up with that sense that there was a world far beyond Atlanta, far beyond the United States. And he took that energy into his domestic civil rights activism. And from the very beginning, From the very beginning, when he became a minister at Ebenezer Baptist, he was interested in the emerging anti-colonial movement in Africa and Asia and in the Caribbean. So he was making those connections that there were no borders, either religiously or racially or nationally, as we've talked about. So from the very beginning, King was an internationalist. He was a globalist.
And he was a man of justice.
Absolutely.
Now, Shelley, King, the last time I checked, never went to law school. The one who went to law school was Thurgood Marshall. How come King seems to be the man that embraced social, economic justice for everybody, for all of us?
I think because he knew how necessary it was. And not only that, I think he really realized how, even though he was, again, based here in the United States and born and raised here and wanted economic, political, and legal justice for people here, he knew that this was still a part of a global fight. So when we think of people in Africa, people throughout the African diaspora, all of us started in Africa. And Africa was subjugated and exploited because of these forces of white supremacy that had an insidious impact on the entire globe, right? So he understood that in order for us to really work on these anti-black practices that are propagated across the globe, that it was really important to unwind and dismantle all of this through the legal system, because that is where it was codified. So when we think about the laws in South Africa and apartheid, and we think of Jim Crow, that is white supremacy that is codified and embedded into law and made normalized. It was made to be normalized through the law and through policies. And he knew that if we were to really, really have some real justice and progress, not only in this country, but across the globe, we had to change the laws.
Reverend Okule, when we look at Martin Luther King Jr., I was talking to some Africans, and they said the person who probably comes first in their mind is not Martin Luther King Jr., but rather is a one Marcus Garvey. And others, in fact, went to the extent of talking about George Padmore. Others talked about Paul Robeson. So why are we talking about MLK?
Yeah, I think if you look at the people you have mentioned, they preceded Martin Luther King Jr. in a way, and they influenced him in some ways. And so prior to Martin Luther King Jr., you had people like Nnamdi Azikiwe, and you had Kwame Nkrumah, who had contacts here. Nnamdi Azikiwe studied at Lincoln University and had contact with Garvey and Du Bois during that time. And so they had brought that struggle back to in the 1950s as Africans were agitating for independence. So there was this cross-Atlantic interaction between those early African Americans who were struggling for liberation and early Africans, from Kwame Nkrumah to Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria to Arap Moi, and so those first generation of Africans were deeply connected, and so they built a transatlantic, communication between them. So that's why some Africans look to that early connections before Martin Luther King Jr. It doesn't mean that Martin Luther King doesn't have an impact, but they try to go to the roots. Where did this begin? What of Du Bois? What of Garvey? What of Paul Robeson? Who, when people were not speaking out, he was able to stand out and speak against what was happening. That at one point the Un-American Senate Committee or Congressional Committee declared him anti-American, and even barred him from traveling outside the country. So there were these earlier people who started the struggle, and they were connected, as I said, to the original agitators of decolonization in Africa. So that's probably why you see people going back to them. And even on the inauguration of Ghana's independence in 1957, Martin Luther King had attended it. And then at that independence, Kwame Nkrumah had said that the independence of Ghana would be meaningless unless the entire continent was free, was decolonized. So things like that. And when Nnamdi Azikiwe was inaugurated as the first president of Nigeria, Dr. King had gone as well.
It is interesting that you mentioned, of course, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. Others call him Du Bois. What is the best way to pronounce him, really? That giant of a man. He's buried in Ghana. I have been to his grave. His wife is also buried next to him. These were some of the mentors, really, of people like Kwame Nkrumah and Azikiwe.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Ms. Wabwire, you have a man here who talks about how injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. Where did he get this from, really? This is a man who grew up during the Jim Crow days. He obviously read about apartheid in South Africa, and he knew there was such a thing as colonialism and kind of stuff.
Right. I think, like we said from the beginning, Dr. King's calling, I'm not even sure that he understood the extent to which this was going. And so he was driven by this bigger dream and vision and promise for freedom for all people. So whether the injustice was being perpetrated through the Jim Crow laws here in the United States, or the apartheid in South Africa, or the brutal colonial rule that was at the time rife in a lot of African countries, it was impossible for him to contain his struggle within the confines or the boundaries of the United States. And you see that how that has evolved over the years to inspire or kind of add fuel to the Pan-Africanism movement. And I can think of one leader from Burkina Faso who obviously ruled way after Dr. King, but just looking at the interlinkages, the intergenerational influence of all of this thinking of the dream and the promise. And you mentioned the March on Washington. While Dr. King championed the Poor People's Campaign, I think of Mr. Sankara in Burkina Faso leading this revolution against French colonial rule, not just in his country, but within the African countries around there. And they're very similar in many ways. They are not identical, but they are very related. On one hand, Dr. King is fighting against, oppression and homelessness and poverty in the United States. And a few years later, after Dr. King is assassinated, Thomas Sankara is leading that revolution in Burkina Faso and leading a campaign very similar to the Poor People's Campaign in his national context, calling about self-determination and raising people out of poverty and giving rights and freedoms to women to champion the cause for justice in their countries.
You know, Ms. Wabwire, you mentioned, of course, this important march in Washington. Was it 1963? Somewhere around that? Mm-hmm. You come from Kenya. Aren't you proud of the fact that a Kenyan by the name of the late Tom Mboya actually had the opportunity to address the rally?
It's one of those things that I think we all ought to constantly read and remind ourselves. And I think, just like President Obama keeps saying, it's not enough to stand on the accomplishments of those who've gone before us, but keep the dream alive, live the promise, and seize the opportunity to change the world, remake history. And so just like Tom Mboya, a fellow statesperson from Kenya, obviously, of course, great pride in that, and to all of us here, because the struggle, as we are saying, was global. And so obviously the fruits should be celebrated by all of us, but even more importantly, where we stand today and what we do with what we have been entrusted to us.
Very interesting. Robert, you know, this great man once observed that in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. What did he exactly mean by that?
Well, there's much to say to that, but I want to piggyback very quickly on what our panelists have said. That 1963 moment, the March on Washington is such an important moment because every year on that anniversary, we get the same soundbite, right? About I have a dream, I have a dream. And it makes King seem to be a type of moderate, sort of out of touch. He's dreaming, right? But as our panelists have said, Sherry said, that march was for freedom, justice, jobs, concrete demands. And the fact that Tom Mboya is there, a Kenyan, addressing this, and at that march, it's announced that W.B. Du Bois, some would say the father of Pan-Africanism, died the night before. Those connections between Kenya and Ghana and the United States speaks to this black freedom struggle that was global from the beginning. So when black people came to these shores in America, for instance, we came enslaved. From the very moment then when we came to these shores, we were thinking about freedom. So that freedom dream goes from Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Ida B. Wells, these prominent women, and it's connected to these international struggles. And so King needs to be looked at as a militant, as a radical, and deeply connected to internationalist black freedom struggles. And I think that moment in 1963 speaks to that. To your question specifically, he was very clear that evil could exist in the world primarily through the silence of well-meaning, good-natured people who were silent at the moment of crisis. And so it wasn't necessarily the KKK that was the primary enemy, per se. I mean, clearly they are an enemy, no question about that. But it was that what he would call that silent majority of people who would not stand up and be counted when it came time to battle for freedom. And so that's what Dr. King meant. He wanted folk to get up, stand up, and actually act on the courage of your convictions to change this world, to actually create that beloved community. When he talked about a beloved community, he talked about a world house. And so it is speaking specifically to black demands quite often, but also he's a deep humanist. He's speaking about human rights for all people. And that's a vision that we need now, today, more than ever.
Is it possible that he perhaps realized that Americans, including black Americans, had constitutional rights? They were citizens who had constitutional rights, who owed allegiance to the state. They were not subjects to an individual authority who in turn would grant them privileges.
Well, that's a connection that Dr. King made. You know, the U.S. South was an authoritarian, undemocratic, one-party state ruled by the Democratic Party from the onset of Jim Crow from the 1890s to the 1960s. Very similar in South Africa, a one-party, undemocratic, authoritarian regime. And so he saw those connections very clearly, that one must fight always for democracy, for full freedom, right? And make those connections to move toward racial justice.
Shirley, Dr. King, before he was assassinated, he talked about how he had a dream that one day he hoped that his children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but rather by the content of their character. Has that been realized so far, in your view?
In my view, I would say, unfortunately, no, it has not been realized. But I do think it's important for us to underscore and highlight the progress that has been made in the past 50 years. And really the progress that has been continued to be made by not only people who were in King's camp, but other freedom-loving people who have really and seriously dedicated their lives and worked toward the liberation of black people and people across the globe. But no, I think we can look to any number of examples here in the United States and see that that dream has not been realized. Especially we can, particularly in these last 4 years, point to anti-black state violence that we've seen that has been revealed by mobile phones and social media. We've seen a lot of deaths and killings of people concentrate on the deaths of black men, but there's been a lot of police brutality against black women, and including sexual misconduct behind bars while women are incarcerated. I mean, there are a myriad of problems that still exist. Unemployment, lack of education, lack of access to education, even voting rights. We're coming up on the anniversary of Equality Day, in which we celebrate when women got the right to vote in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. But we know that for women of color, not just black women, but for Asian women, for Latinas, there were still hurdles because Asian people still had problems even trying to become citizens in this country, so that automatically just barred them from having the right to vote. So when we say, is the dream still alive? Yes, it is, but has the dream been fulfilled? Absolutely not.
What about you, Reverend Okule? He was a drum major of justice. He was a son, a descendant of Africa, who stood on the top of the mountain as tall as probably as Kilimanjaro, and said, you know what? Africa needs really to be treated fairly. He was on the side of those people who obviously were struggling against colonialism. Colonialism has ended, and yet there seems to be no justice on the African continent, at least most of it. Why?
That's a very intriguing question. And it could be a whole event by itself. Yeah, why? I think that when we look at the entire continent, and then in the context of what we are talking about here, justice, in the context of the dignity of the human person, which Martin Luther King was fighting, in the context of human solidarity, in the context that, you know, if we want to achieve something good for all of us, don't concentrate on yourself. Seek the good of all, and then you benefit from it. I think as we look at the current scenario across the continent and the injustice perpetrated this time around, not so much by outsiders, but by leaders who are the conduits of injustice into the continent. What do I mean by that? The basic problem that we see in the continent now is leadership deficit. Is the problem of governance. And so we have people in leadership position who continue in some ways, and even worse, the exploitation of the masses, the exploitation of the people who think first of themselves and not of the common good, who are able to bring multinational corporations in to exploit the people and get a few $1,000s in their pockets and look the other way. So the whole issue of fighting for liberation, it is far-fetched, you know, on the continent. We could say that, okay, we achieved independence from colonial rule, but has colonization ended? Absolutely not.
What kind of independence are you talking about?
Exactly.
Are you talking about what some characterize as
I think you just
flag independence?
Changing the flag. Changing the flag and changing the color of leaders, you know, in many continents. I mean, if you look at what is happening, some of the African leaders, I don't know how to put this, I would say some of the African leaders are even worse than their colonial masters.
Are they leaders, or are they, as some suggest, probably rulers?
Rulers, yeah. Rulers or dictators or whatever name we call them. Because what is happening, as you look across the continent, even starting with the Central African region, you know, you look at the leaders there, you know, and then you go down south, go down out west. One thing comes across. Those leaders, those rulers, to be exact, those rulers don't care for the common good. And it is really impossible for a country to develop without carrying everybody along, number one. Number two is that if that country doesn't seek the national interest as primary in so many ways, it will not advance. And thirdly, if the country doesn't exploit the talents within the country, you know, it is wasting the human resources of its people. And that is a problem that afflicts the continent in so many ways. The waste of human resources, the waste of natural resources, and the inability or refusal to harness the resources, both human and material resources, for the common good. And so when we look at what is going on, yes, independence, you've changed the flag, but the whole thing continues. And if I may add to that is that if you look at during the colonial era, you had 8 countries colonizing the continent, exploiting it the way they wanted. But now, the field has opened much wider. Governments as governments have receded to the background. We have multinational corporations, giving, from agroecology to technology gurus to all of that, exploiting the continent. And we have new players landing. During the colonial era, they were mostly European countries. Now you have China barging in, you have Russia barging in, and
you also had the Ottoman Empire.
You had the
by
Ottoman,
Turkey.
yes, that are barging in. So you have a lot of colonialists on the continent now than there were 57 years ago when Ghana first achieved independence. And so that has opened another perspective to what is happening, to what the injustice that Martin Luther King was talking about, to the human solidarity and the common good. I repeat that word, the common good, that the rulers are not taking it as part of what their responsibilities are. Leaders are supposed to seek the welfare of the people they are leading, and that is absent in most countries.
Ms. Wabwire, you obviously heard the Reverend. He seemed to say that the African rulers, if I might use that word advisedly, have pretty much inherited a certain track with a specific engine, and the engine has not been changed. So it's more of the same, really. How can you reverse the situation so that these rulers can indeed become leaders who at least have who are social, economically, and politically sensitive to their people?
Great question. And before I respond specifically to that, I just want to share that when I was growing up in Kenya, before I read any scholarship around Dr. King or any of these Pan-Africanists, there was this constant reinforcement or teaching around our shared humanity, around our interdependence on each other, that I owed my selfhood to the other person, and to the broader context of Ubuntu as we know it, I am because we are,
what
right?
If I'm not a Muntu?
Well, you are in this
What
case.
if I'm
like
a Nilotic? Africa is made up of more than Bantu. In fact, some people have suggested what we need is Bantuphone.
Bantuphone, whatever we call it, but the concept remains, for as long as we don't lose sight of what this really meant. It's a beautiful thing. And so having said that, I think to Father Anieri's point about where we've gone wrong is really going back to what we've talked about, losing sight of that vision, losing sight of the dream and the promise that all of this revolutionaries kind of handed to us. But you think of the struggle or the goal that Dr. King and all of these other Pan-Africanists stood for as a process. So each one of us has a responsibility. Every generation that comes, it's not an event.
One incident. And
it would be wrong to assume that what they handed to us is where we should stop. And I think that's part of the problem.
Very interesting.
They handed the baton to us, but what have we done with it? And I think that's the challenge, the struggle that we see on the continent today. I will also say that what gives me hope is the future of Africa, which is Africa's youth.
Africa's youth, and probably
youth,
in tandem with social media.
Great combination, powerful force there. And I say this because not only Africa has the youngest population in the world. But what that brings, the promise of that, if we tapped into that right as we should, the energy and the innovation and all of the good things that come with a youthful population, they are demanding good governance in ways that I think the previous generation has failed. They want leaders who see and bring the best in them. They want leaders that honor the social contract they have between the governed and those who govern.
Because they are not invested in the status quo.
Absolutely. And I think that's a beautiful thing to be. It's a good place to be. I mean, these are people who are being born with cell phones and ready to innovate. So the baggage of that colonialism and all of these things that we talk about and bog us down, they are free from that. And I think that's great promise if well tapped into.
That reminds me of, was it the 70s during the Vietnam War, when college students were drafted to go to the front line. Guess what happened on American campuses? They wanted the end of the war. Very interesting. I'm reminded, by the way, that I am being a little bit undemocratic because I am not going to the studio audience. So I think I really have to do that. And for that reason, let's go to the studio and see what kind of questions they have. You have to go behind a microphone. Tell us your name, your affiliation, and of course your question. And please try to be as succinct as humanly possible.
I'll try, Shaka. Thank you, Shaka, and wonderful panels.
My
name is Abdi Yabaro. I'm the chief of the VOS Somali service. Somali is the issue, so I will address what I stand for. We discussed a lot about what Martin Luther King has done, and I would like to address this question to Mrs. Sherry Williams, who said his dreams were not achieved. In my memories, the African Americans was only allowed to go to even to the booths and participate in election in 1963, if I'm not mistaken. I came to this country in 1981, only maybe 16 years after that. So for the 37 years I have been here, I've seen a lot of change. And it touched me when you talk about that dreams were not being fulfilled. I know that so many has done, but my question is, what do you think was not fulfilled, and how we can achieve the kind of things that you have in mind, and who should be addressed to fulfill those dreams that you think it's lacking?
Thank you very much. What about that, Shelly?
Okay, well, first I just have to say that I think if anyone had the answer to that particular question, that all of us might be in a different social and political situation. So I'm not sure if I have the complete answer to that question, but I do have some ideas. But when you ask what are some of the things that have not been fulfilled, again, I don't mean to sound redundant and repetitive, but like this state-sanctioned violence against black people, because one of the things that Martin Luther King was totally for the country actually taking a look at and eradicating was the ways in which police were brutally interacting with black people in particular, but people across the board, because this is someone who was jailed several times throughout his career as an activist and actually saw firsthand what it was like to not actually have encounters with the police, but also to be incarcerated. And then when we fast forward 50 years later, we see that there is actually a system of profit that is built on the exploitation of black bodies inside of the prison industrial complex. So when we think of what has not been achieved, it's still some of the same old issues that Dr. King and all of his comrades talked about back then. Police brutality, access to jobs, access to voting even, because we see that there were parts of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that were dismantled. These voter ID laws, closing down early voting, all of these different ways in voter ID same-day voting, registration, all of these ways in which there had been progress for people to have access to voting are now being rolled back. And one of the things that I would like to say, though, because we haven't really talked about this very much, and I totally understand why, because this is a focus on Dr. King, but I also think it's important for us to also realize how he was not just one person doing this work alone. He was doing this work with an alliance of people, and people who we don't necessarily still recognize and give their just due to now, even including women like not only Rosa Parks, that's a name that a lot of us know, the women like Diane Nash, Amelia Boynton, Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, a queer black man, Bayard Rustin, who was pretty much the architect of the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. So even
what about Harry Belafonte?
Harry Belafonte, so many others, but we do recognize me in a lot. That's why I left him out just right now. But we are still working and striving toward rights for women and rights for LGBT people. Dr. King, the last thing that he was working on was the Poor People's Campaign. And when we look at wealth disparities now, just across the board, they have grown vastly, and specifically for people of color. So, I mean, there's a lot that still has to be achieved. Now, how we go about doing that, I don't have the answers for that. I don't have the answers, Sway. But at the same time, you asked whose responsibility is it? It's everyone's responsibility, because you talked to someone I remember started talking about boycotting. I remember someone saying that a little bit earlier. Oh no, I think it was an idea that I had. But when you talked about complicity, I'm sorry, I was talking about. I'm really not feeling well today, so I'm kind of all over the place. But you talked about, you asked the question about King saying like about people's responsibility and when people should act, and like it's not the other people not acting, it's your friends being silent. And I think one of the things that we have to all understand is that when you ask whose responsibility is it to work on these issues, it's everyone's responsibility, because if we're not actively working against dismantling some of these issues, then we are in some ways complicit. So I think that's another thing that we have to realize. So you talk about being complicit. So when there is a company that we know that taps into prison labor, that is an extension of the exploitation of black bodies, do you do business with that company? You know, so what stand do you take? I mean, everyone is not going to get out on the front lines and go to a march or lead a rally or, you know, stand and participate in a sit-in or something like that. But there are ways that we can act with our dollars, which I think is also really important, because King was talking about spreading out wealth and making sure that everyone had an opportunity to just have basic access to food, housing, clothing, and education.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but what about Jesse Jackson? Didn't he do a bit of that kind of strategy in Chicago?
He definitely did,
yeah.
In Chicago and across the globe.
Across the globe. Very interesting. Let's go to the audience again, please. Let's be a little bit more democratic this time. Any particular question?
Somebody there.
Yeah, could you please go behind which microphone?
He's there.
Okay.
He's right there.
Go ahead. Your name and affiliation and, of course, question.
Sure. I'm here on my own behalf, but we've touched on a lot of civil rights leaders that were important in Africa. I'd like to hear just a little bit about Malcolm X, and I'd also like to know who's carrying the baton now and who's the drum major for civil rights and justice.
Thank you very much, Paul Cisco, my man. What about you, Robert? How do you respond to that?
Sure, right. We can't really have a conversation about black freedom struggles and Martin Luther King without Malcolm X, right? And Malcolm X is vitally important to that idea of internationalism. In the last year of his life, for instance, he made 3 separate trips to Africa, was very interested in Pan-Africanism on the African continent, and actually created an organization based on the Organization of African Unity, his organization, the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And what he wanted to do was use these newly independent African countries, work with them, and work together to bring a case against the United States government, charging them with genocide, with the treatment of black peoples. He wanted to take that case to the United Nations. So here, Malcolm X, deep black nationalist, deep freedom fighter, also a great internationalist. And quite often, Malcolm X is pitted against Martin Luther King as if they are sort of oppositional forces. They wanted the same thing. They wanted human rights. They wanted full justice. They had slightly different ways of getting at it. But we often pit them against each other as if they were polar opposites. So I would say just a little bit about that with Malcolm X. Reading Malcolm's last speeches in his last year, and reading Martin Luther King, hearing his speeches from his last year, and reading King's last book, Chaos or Community, if you read where Malcolm X and Martin Luther King is in the last year of their lives, they are so ideologically and politically intertwined. And the issues that they were both dealing with, King, Chaos or Community, racism, poverty, war, those are issues that are still with us today, right? That question about who is the drum major today, moving forward today, I'm going to piggyback on Dr. Williams' answer here. Our concept of leadership has to be beyond looking at the great men. Quite often men, we look at men, although there's so many women engaged in the struggle. It's really all of us. We're all leaders. We all have the capacity to lead. And that's what the civil rights movement was really about. It wasn't just Martin Luther King, right? He was part of a grassroots movement that involved ordinary, everyday men, women, and children who empowered themselves to analyze their situation and come up with solutions to their particular problems. That was leadership. And that inheritance is there for all of us to have.
Talking about women, where would you place the beautiful, intellectual Angela Davis?
Oh, and well, okay. So there's so much to say here, right? And so we've named some names. So from Sojourner Truth to Harriet Tubman to Ida B. Wells in the 19th century, we've gone forward referencing a number of people in the civil rights movement. Shirley Graham Du Bois, Eslanda Robeson, Angela Davis is in that tradition of fighting for justice, dealing with the problem of mass incarceration. From a very early age, engaging in questions around what's happening. If you read George Jackson's Soledad Brother, for instance, when we look at Angela Davis on the front lines of that, and also herself dealing with the threat of incarceration, being persecuted by the United States government, right? Angela Davis
and by
is
Governor Reagan
an
of
important,
California at the time.
Absolutely, that's right. And so Angela Davis is in that model of activist intellectualism, right? Bringing together study, thought, and active engagement, political engagement. So she is part, like Martin Luther King, like Malcolm X, part of that tradition of critical analysis and action fighting for freedom.
Robert, what about the great artist, activist, Pan-Africanist, and lawyer? He did his law degree at Columbia Law School. I'm talking about Paul Robeson.
Right. Again, so we're in this moment now. Paul Robeson was many things, as you mentioned. One other thing he was an athlete. He was a football player, All-American football player at Rutgers. And while he was a lawyer, an activist, an artist, he stands also in the tradition of black athletes engaging in social justice activity. And this is a particularly important moment now when we're looking at NFL players, NBA players engaged in political activism, using that platform to address issues of social injustice. These athletes today are standing on the legacy of people like Paul Robeson, who used his fame, his fortune, his platform to speak out against all forms of racial injustice in America, in Africa, and around the world. And he paid a heavy price for it. His passport was revoked. He couldn't travel overseas.
As a matter of fact, he was denied to attend the Ghana independence.
Absolutely, right? And so we have a moment here where we have to consider folk who had the courage of the convictions and lost everything and still carried on. Here I stand. His memoir speaks to that tradition of struggle and sacrifice. It's also important to talk about Du Bois and why he died in Ghana, because he was so disgusted with how he was treated in this country. Here's a person who was a leader in the civil rights movement and the Pan-African movement, and by the 1950s was so persecuted, also denied the passport, right? That he left the country, renounced U.S. citizenship, and lived the rest of his life in Ghana. Found refuge on the African continent. right? So that's a tradition of folks sacrificing, making
He's a
real
treasure.
sacrifices. That's a legacy that we can take and use in our own lives today.
Paul Robeson, by the way, was also not only a colleague, but a mentor to many of Africa's founding leaders, including yours truly, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Kwame Nkrumah, Leopold Sedar Senghor of Senegal, and all those kind of people. Very interesting. This is a question that I will ask the panel, and whoever thinks that he can hit it, go for it. We talk about Martin Luther King Jr. We talk about a lot of things and stuff like that. But it is quite possible that there are certain things that people probably don't know about him. What would that be, for example?
Well, I'll jump in for a second. I think people know this, but I don't think people realize how masterful he was in his use of mass media. Because thinking of historically where not only the nation was, but also where media was, and also how the mainstream media and how the country as a whole viewed black people, he was able to craft his activism in a way to tap into this emerging medium of television and help to create some images that really showed injustice and subjugation and just how rabid racism was in action in these live pictures that were not only just distributed across this country, but that were distributed across the globe. So the ways in which he was able to tap Diane Nash to be a public relations person, right? Because, I mean, who ever heard of a public information officer back then? But he had that foresight to actually create media strategies and tap into the mass media so that he could be able, not alone, again, not alone and solely, but to be able to spread this message, not only the message of liberation, not only just across the country, but across the globe.
What about information that Harry Belafonte actually did buy him life insurance without his knowledge?
Yeah. Well, I think that, yeah, that is information that people probably don't know, but I think it also spoke to the daily threats of violence that he and others in the movement faced that people today probably don't realize just how insidious it was. Because I went to college in Jackson, Mississippi, Jackson State University, and one which it's a landmark now, but we think of Medgar Evers just going home and being killed in his own driveway. With his babies asleep in the house with his wife. So just this real, just constant threat of very real and vicious violence is something that I don't think that we necessarily keep in mind today.
Right. I think he was exhausted at the end of his life, and partially because we don't realize this, but he was deeply unpopular throughout America at the time of his death. And there were many, even in the civil rights movement, who felt that his very courageous stand against the Vietnam War was strategically the wrong play against the president, Lyndon Johnson, who had helped pass the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So even with, and there were younger people using the language of black power, questioning nonviolent tactics alone. And so he was under pressure from all sides, but particularly dealing with death threats constantly. The exhaustion of being an activist over a long period of time, I think, is underappreciated. The type of pressure that not just him, but his whole family and many other activists are dealing with, the threat of death at any moment. Right? I think that's extraordinarily important to remember about King, that he was deeply unpopular toward the end of his life. Even as we celebrate him now, we forget why he was unpopular, because he continued to take those courageous stands.
What about the man that Eleanor Roosevelt, the first lady, of course, wife to FDR, used to refer as Mr. United Nations, Ralph Bunche?
So Ralph Bunche, of course, Nobel Peace Prize winner, and Dr. King was also a Nobel Peace Prize winner. I think where Bunche and King might have some interplay is on the international forum. And I'll mention just this one part with South Africa. King understood the difficulties of working nonviolent strategies in South Africa. He looked at South Africa as even a worse case of institutionalized white supremacy than the United States. And his idea was thinking creatively about international nonviolence, economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation of the South African regime, bringing them to the negotiating table, combined with domestic mass organization within South Africa. That sort of creative way of thinking about the United Nations, for instance, and thinking about what he called international nonviolence with pressure against the South African regime eventually proved to be rather effective in the 1980s. So I think in those ways, Bunch and King might have some symmetry on the international stage.
Very interesting. What about, you talked about, of course, Malcolm X, the man who was called, was it Detroit Red, with the zoot suit. What about the author of the autobiography of Malcolm X? I'm talking about Alex Haley. I'm talking about Alex Haley.
Someone's calling with an answer to that.
Really? A man who, of course, is probably better known for Roots. And I know him, even for me personally, I like him because he once said that find something good in someone and praise it.
Well, when you mentioned Alex Haley,
yes,
we can talk about Alex. I remember as a young boy looking at Roots and having some understanding in that miniseries how that was must-see TV. And bringing that in touch with some aspects of slavery and emancipation in our country. But when you mentioned Malcolm X, I immediately thought about Detroit Red.
Yes.
And the fact that Malcolm X was incarcerated for several years. And when we're talking about this era of mass incarceration, Malcolm X, that example of his prison time and how he used that prison time and how he came out of prison so deeply politically conscious, it makes me think about how many young women and men incarcerated now could be Malcolm X.
Very interesting.
Right?
Let's be a little bit more inclusive. Let's go to the audience.
Yes, hi. My name is Laura. I'm a French-American citizen and social entrepreneur based in Haiti.
Really?
My question is, so in the US in the 60s, in the history and today, a lot of the violence is state violence, for example, the police against the people, or citizens against other citizens. So white people against people of color, or just people against each other. In Africa, before, but still nowadays, it's more of an international violence, where a lot of the oppressors before were colonialist Europeans, but now, like you mentioned, it's more of an economical violence. So my question is, how can the dream, the I have a dream, be reached on a continent where the oppression comes from the outside, and it's not a problem to fix in the inside? If you know what I mean.
Very interesting. By the way, time is not our best ally. Could you please respond?
Yeah, I think you've touched on something that is very germane to the very future of the African continent, is that the violence continues. As I mentioned earlier, this time not so much state-sponsored violence, but violence from the economic community, violence from resource extractors, violence from people who want land, violence from people who just want the basic resources of the continent and excluding the people. But when I look at all of that, how do you address that? I think that the advocacy that needs to be done is to empower the people, to enlighten the people to rise up against these intruders. That needs to be done on the one hand, but also to hold the leaders accountable, because they are the ones that open the door for the predators to come in. And very often with informed consent from the rulers. And so they come in and take as much as they want, leave the rulers with the pittance, and the people are gone.
Unfortunately, again, time is not our best ally. My thanks and gratitude to our guests, Professor Robert Vinson, Dr. Sherry Williams, Reverend Nyedi Okule, and last but not least, Faustine Wawire. You've been watching and listening to VOA Special Edition of Straight Talk Africa, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Global Vision for Justice Live from the School of Communication at American University here in Washington, D.C. The moment for our television and radio audience, only we must end our broadcast, but you may switch over to watch the remaining 30 minutes of watching our town hall special live from American University here in Washington, D.C. via the internet. Let's continue our program. Our panelists today are the Reverend Nyedi Okule, Executive Director, Africa Faith and Justice Network, Sherry Williams, Assistant Professor at American University School of Communication, American University, Faustine Wawire, Senior Manager of Policy and Advocacy at the Management Sciences for Health, and last but not least, Robert Vinson, Associate Professor of History and Africana Studies at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. Well, ladies and gentlemen, once again, I have to say that I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host you on this special edition of Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
I'm honored to be here.
You're most welcome. And of course, let me ask you a question. Are there any examples on the African continent, at least as far as you know, who are carrying the torch from Dr. King, really?
Yeah, you know, I'm glad you brought that up, because when the gentleman asked who is holding the baton today, you know, and I think we need to return to that. You know, okay, starting with the continent we're talking about, I think that, okay, as I look around, I know certain countries are trying. Somebody mentioned Burkina Faso. Let me start with a small country there.
You mean the late Captain Sankara?
Yes, yes.
Certainly not to praise Campayori.
You know, with Burkina Faso, what happens? What has happened in the last 5 years in that tiny country is an example of people trying to get the baton going. Because when you look at the whole struggle of Martin Luther King Jr., it wasn't just himself. It was the ability to harness the people across board, men and women, black and white, Christians, Jews, to come together and fight an evil. Because when the human being is diminished, by virtue of our human solidarity, we participate in being diminished. And that's something we don't often understand. We said, oh, it's happening to them over there. It's not them, it's us. And so that understanding that we are all in it together should bring us to understand that the struggles, the assault on a particular group of people, whether it be here in the United States or in Africa or Asia, is an assault on humanity, and we should rise to it. So in Burkina Faso, the population realized that they need to do something for themselves. And Blaise Compaoré had been there. By the way, he's attributed to assassinating Thomas Sankara.
That is correct.
I don't have the proof, but that's the rumor. And was there for 28 years oppressing the people. And people say, we've had enough. Let's rise. And it took a group of women to say, we've had enough. We want our children to have a better future. And they marched into the city, Ouagadougou. And they were armed with weapons. You know what it was? The spatula, you know? Because traditionally, the spatula is used to make food and nourish you. But if an African woman, especially in Burkina Faso, use the spatula as a weapon, it means it's over.
Really?
You've reached a point of no reconciliation. Actually, a friend of mine Bazemo Barthelemy, from Burkina Faso, as we speak, is writing a doctoral dissertation on that right now. But so they went with the spatula and said to Blaise Compaoré, we've had enough. We want a better future for our children. But
they also got allies among the young presidential guard soldiers.
Yes, but what happened is that because they went en masse, just a couple of thousand of them in the first place, because they did that and tapping into the African culture, if your mother goes out for battle and you as a child, especially a male child, are sitting at home, it's like saying, "Curse be the day you were born," So if mom is out there, you need to go there. Right. So once they did that, the next day, over 1 million people showed out in protest in Ouagadougou, and Blaise Compaoré was gone. So that's an aspect of harnessing the resources within to forge a better future. We have seen also in other parts people trying to fight corruption in so many ways. I know Buhari in Nigeria came in with the idea of fighting corruption, and which is a big disease, not just in Nigeria but across the continent. So to go back to that question, who are the carriers of the baton today? I think we need to realize that the problem is so large that we really don't need one or two people to drag to carry the baton, but to collectively mobilize the population, the youth that have been mentioned. We have social media, we have all kinds of things. In fact, the explosion of social media in Africa is phenomenal. So we can mobilize people to carry the baton collectively and make a change for the better.
When you talk about President Buhari trying to fight corruption in Nigeria or graft, we should point out, by the way, that when it comes to corruption in Nigeria, you're not talking about benign corruption here.
Acute corruption.
You're talking about malevolent corruption. Let's go to the audience, by the way, for contribution.
Talking about this baton, I've just learned that this young parliamentarian, activist, and entertainer Bobby Wine has been arrested in Uganda. Do any of you know more about that than I do?
I personally don't know much, but we are investigating, people come up like that. Why I'm emphasizing collective force is that it's difficult to arrest a crowd than to address one person, because we see the same thing that is happening in Uganda. In Angola, this journalist who was given an award by the National Endowment for Democracy for exposing corruption went back, and it was last year, it was charged with terrorism, subversing government. We see in Cameroon, people who stand up to talk about it, and they are picked up one by one. But so it was in realizing that when you put out one person or two people, the state easily is able to capture them and silence the voice. But if people go like we are all the carriers of the baton, there are 2,000 of us, it's very difficult for the state to put 2,000 of us in jail. So that's why I was going that route. But to your question and to that remark, it is very important. It's not enough to talk about what happened in the past. We need to say, how do we continue that dream today? How do we make impact? How do we make sure that the rights and dignity of God's children are respected here and now?
Francisco, for your information, Bobby Wine is like a sort of Ugandan version of the American...
Paul Robeson.
Yes, Paul Robeson. He has actually appeared on Straight Talk Africa some time back, and we hope to get him back if he wins back his freedom. But he's an interesting man who uses his art, who uses his music as a form of social change, really, advocating social change. He's a man who believes in socio-economic justice for all of us.
I think there's another example of the baton. You know, Dr. King, of course, we're talking about governance, sometimes bad governance, and Dr. King obviously was a critic of bad governance in this country and beyond. But there were also critics of Dr. King's sort of top-down leadership style. There were those in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, for instance, SNCC, who believed in a more grassroots community organizing base,
right.
More broad. And I think today in the United States, perhaps the greatest example of carrying the baton forward, even beyond, is Black Lives Matter. So Bayard Rustin, for instance, could not come out fully as a gay man out in the open in that organizing the March on Washington because there was still great social stigma. And it might have set back the movement in some way. That was the feeling. Mm-hmm. Black Lives Matter is far beyond that moment. And looking at the full intersectionality and building on that community tradition. South Africa, Fees Must Fall movement, student groups. Yes. So we have these movements that are broader based, young people engage in it, and not looking for the sort of charismatic leadership model that sometimes we look at Dr. King in that position.
Yeah, and if I can jump in too, I'm sorry, because I wanted to say this a little bit earlier, but there are a lot of groups. I wouldn't necessarily point to individuals, but a lot of groups that are doing some really important work, and groups that are led by young Black people, led by young women, and also particularly led by young Black women who are queer women of color. And there are groups like Dream Defenders who are doing a lot of great work across the country. I think of a group called Southerners on New Ground that's based in Atlanta, but they're all throughout the South. And again, in this moment, when we're talking about police brutality and the ways in which the prison industrial complex affects Black people, in particular, people are always focusing on this patriarchal fallback of Black men. But last year, or the year before, Southerners on New Ground started, along with some other groups, this campaign to bail Black mothers out of jail. Because one of the things that we don't necessarily think about is how there is a rising number of Black women who are incarcerated. And a lot of them are single mothers, and a lot of them are breadwinners for their families, and they're sandwiched. They are breadwinners for not only their own children, but also their elders. So last year, Song was bailing out Black mothers for Mother's Day from jail, and they did the same thing this year. I think of groups like that, and also people like Ashley Yates, Janetta Elzie, Tef Poe. There are so many people who are doing a lot of really good work but because of who they are, and because this generation of activists is not your grandmother's or your grandfather's group of activists where you can't catch these hands, so to speak, and they're not really shrouded in respectability politics, they don't necessarily get the media coverage that they deserve, because in the media's mind, there should be one particular kind of leader and one particular kind of spokesperson who does really kind of fit into this hegemonic mold that these activists today don't really fit into, they don't ascribe to, and they don't want to.
In fact, I should point out, Sherry and Robert, that one example on the African continent that went through the type of student organization that you described, or activist, is the current South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa.
Right.
He comes from that kind of background. Mm-hmm. I think
I just wanted to add also,
Yes,
I think while we only get to hear of these stories once perhaps the government has, clamped down on activists and stuff like that, there's something to be said about that. And that's a renewed sense of political consciousness and these young people. And so while it may be presented as bloody and chaotic and all of that, but there's that agitation that can no longer wait. And I mean, it's what it is. It's going to be bad before it gets stable and better, but I think it's a necessary process that we
So
have
who
to
can
deal
provide that type of civic education, for example, which is very, very vital, really, to democracy? Dictatorship governments obviously are not, they're not willing to provide that type of education.
And they will not, because Dr. King said, you don't expect oppressors to give you the freedom. You've got to fight and attain it. Sankara said a very similar thing. In fact, just, kind of get in touch with what he stood for. He has this dream that's very similar to Dr. King, and he dares his country people to dare to invent the future. That's a statement that he repeatedly used. And so I think we are seeing that rebirth in the young generation of activists that we are seeing. Who's responsible for that? I think, again, the onus is on all of us in our respective places where we are. I currently teach a course in public advocacy and human rights, and I've found a new space to really talk about these issues in ways that might go outside of my everyday professional engagement. And so all of us have a responsibility.
During my last trip to Southern Africa, I was in Zimbabwe and Malawi. I had the opportunity to interview one of Malawi's former president, Bakiri Muluzi, the second Malawian president of the republic after Dr. Hastings Kamuzu Banda himself. And he talked about how education is very important. Yes, PhDs are important, but even more importantly, he said, we're talking about the sort of education that accesses people to become socially and politically conscious. Because until and unless you have that type of people, you're not going to get democracy in Africa.
Yeah, he's absolutely right. Actually, the organization I work for, the Africa Faith and Justice Network, realizes just that. And so in the last 5 years, is undertaken what they call Just Governance Project. What is it? We've been in Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana. It's in several countries, and it's continuing. And what it does is to give people techniques of advocacy, techniques of social analysis, citizenship education. He's right.
No, you're right.
It's not a question of, yeah, no, you are right.
Understand
that the king is king thanks to you. Because most Africans see their leaders as doing their bosses.
Yes.
No.
When they bring a road in their neighborhood, it is a favor.
They clap for them. I said, no, you have to understand that your president is somebody you employ.
Precisely.
You know?
Precisely.
You employ your president, and so your president, your leaders are accountable to you. So that's the kind of education. And we are seeing people take action. We've seen even a group of nuns, take action. They went to Abuja, to the National Assembly, with placards, 87 nuns from all over the place. Go over and said, stop the nonsense. We own the resources. So we see that and we need to build more and more on that in civic education. Let Africans understand that the resources, they own the government doesn't own them.
But they are the main stakeholders. They
are the stakeholders, they can kick out the government. In fact, I remember telling a group of Ghanaians, when we were doing advocacy, just this past June, I said, okay, when you look for a job, what happens? People advertise, you apply, right? And they do interview, they say yes, and one of you is picked up, said yes. And then, is that person selected the boss of the company or works for the company? And they said, no, he works for the company. I said, that's how you choose your president. They come campaigning, vote for me, and you said, okay, we employ this one. And once he gets there, you go back home. No, you supervise the president and make sure that he's doing the right thing. So we are seeing that kind of agitation and the level of engagement. The panel have, variously talked about the energy that is coming from young people realizing that they have a stake in it. And that's what we are trying to do.
I think there is a gentleman there who is dying to ask a question.
Thank you. My name is Professor Russell Williams. No relation to Dr. Sherry Williams, except as a colleague. And I'd like to direct this question to Ms. Wabwiri. Because one of the most fascinating things happened to me in Nairobi in 1984. I was there working on a project, but more importantly, I was at a house party. At this house party, the woman who hosted this party had essentially all the books that I was reading back here in the United States on her bookshelf. So Jomo Kenyatta, Oginga Odinga, Nkrumah, Malcolm X, MLK, all the way down the line. So while all these other people were dancing and having a good time, we sat on the couch and we talked about, what did our civil rights movement feel like from her side of the ocean, And we talked about how Jomo Kenyatta and Odinga and Nkrumah felt like on this side of the ocean. My real question is, do you think that African Americans and African youth are getting any closer, especially through the use of social media? We don't need the leadership figure so much as we did a few decades ago, but do you, because there's still, I feel, some semblance of intra-racial racism. So are we getting any closer to understanding what racism looks like in this country versus what racism looks like on the continent? Anybody can answer, but since this epiphany happened to me in Nairobi.
Which part of Nairobi?
I take responsibility.
Which part of Nairobi?
No, thank you for your question, Mr. Williams. And I think it's fascinating on many levels. First, I thought you were going to ask, do we understand each other and our struggles enough? And perhaps that's one way of looking at it. And if that is your question, then we still have a long way to go in terms of just understanding our journeys and our various struggles in our different contexts. And like I said at the beginning, these struggles are related, but they're not identical. And in many ways, I think the fact that there has been very little education in the usual spaces where we receive education and instruction in schools, I don't think that there has been sufficient attention paid to that aspect on the other side of the continent. And just like when I came to this side of the Atlantic, I learned just how little there is an understanding on what the continent actually stands for and looks like. So the short of it is, no, we still have a long way to go, and really appreciate you raising that question. But having said that, and we have a social media expert on the panel, very glad, I honestly just think that my own experience and understanding has just widened so much in the few years that I've lived in the US compared to all of the years that I spent in my home country of Kenya, in terms of understanding the interrelationship between the struggles of Africans on the continent and the struggle of African American here. And one of that is thanks to social media, because it really breaks down in ways that if you are really open to this, then there is no excuse. There's lots of information out there, but you have to want to get it. You have to want to understand and engage. Find spaces where all these issues are being talked about and be part of that. And so I find myself in that space, and that has been very helpful. But I'll defer to Dr. Sherry here, but I just really think that it's a time as we have these conversations, it's ripe for our communities, our beloved communities, to really be intentional about learning on our respective victories and challenges.
Sherry, how can we do better? We're talking about the Africans separated by the Atlantic Ocean, really. Because let's face it, those who came much earlier than us, those Nkrumahs we're talking about, those Paul Robeson we're talking about, they seem to have done much better. Yeah. And yet they had incredible disadvantages, really. Right now, I can conclusively say that the intellectual balance of power has been shifting in our favor. What are we doing with it in order to make the lives of our people really worthwhile?
So when you ask the question, do you mean in terms of like relations between Africans and African Americans? Is that
Correct.
what you're talking about? Okay.
Africans and the African diaspora.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I do think there's a lot of work that definitely needs to be done. I think that a lot of us are still living under these anti-Black and ideas and images that have really circulated across the globe through mass media, through mainstream media of the continent. So I think that I think here in the United States, that there are some African Americans who still have some of these negative colonial imperialistic ideas about what Africa is and about who Africans are. But because we do have a lot of access to information now, particularly through social media, I don't think that's an excuse, but I don't think that we should underestimate the role in the ways in which media has socialized all of us, not just in terms of about race and racism, but also in how we see each other on a domestic and a global scale. So I just think that we have to really realize that what we see, particularly as African Americans, we are always concerned about how we are portrayed in the media, because we know that there are myths and distortions that circulate these ideas that are only part of our story, or really just the worst parts of our story, or what used to be our story. But all of us across the African diaspora know that there are people in power who circulate those ideas and those images because they are used as an excuse to justify our oppression. But I think what we need to do throughout the diaspora is to understand and recognize that we only see one type of African. We only see, and I thought The Beast of No Nations was a really good movie now, but when we think of the kind of images in which we see Africans in this contemporary context, it is most often as a warlord, right? And really through this violent prism. But the reason why we see that is because there are folks who want us to look at each other like that. They want us to fear one another because they don't want us to form these coalitions and alliances so that we can be more powerful to one another and start to take down and dismantle these systems that are oppressing all of us together and topple them over.
You know, Shelley, I was looking at the independence of Ghana, March 6, 1957, in Accra. Nkrumah is saying, as the Reverend said earlier, that the independence of Ghana would be meaningless unless it was linked with the total liberation of Africa. He did not simply talk the talk, he actually walked the talk, so that Africans could walk the walk by providing the necessary tools and all kind of stuff. And one of the important pictures that I remember is the picture of this gentleman in Chicago who used to own Ebony magazine. Was he Robinson something?
John Johnson.
Precisely, Johnson. I mean, you can see. In fact, he was sitting next to Nkrumah. We need those types of images.
We do. We do. We need those types of images. And really what we need to do is to support ethnic media. Because I know you mentioned being from Somalia. When I lived in Columbus, Ohio, that is one of the second largest communities of Somalis in the United States. And there were quite a few local and Somali independent newspapers and media outlets that were sprouting up. And so it was, you know, incumbent on the community to start to support them. So we need to support ethnic media. We need to support Black media so that they can have the resources to continue to tell those stories. Because we already know that people of color are at a disadvantage when it comes to capital and the money and the resources to be able to do pretty much anything. But it costs money to send reporters out to go cover stories. It costs money to buy cameras. It costs money to buy airtime. It costs money to do all of this. So we have to support our own media so that we can start projecting the kind of images of one another that we want to see.
Time is not our best ally. How can we possibly interact with our governments to make sure that when you say you are holding an election in Africa, it is an election, not a selection? Because elections in Africa, frankly, seem to be elections not for the primary stakeholders, the people themselves, but probably for the developing partners. You have a minute.
Yeah, you know, and you know, you bring in something I wish we had at least 5 minutes to talk about, but you know, to do that, people have to understand the levels of foreign intervention, you know, or corporate interventions in elections. They're happening over and over. Look at here, us struggling about Russia intervention in our election, but it's something that happens in Africa over and over. So how do we do that? It goes back to civic education you were talking about, that the people will know that when they go to vote, they stay at the polling booth and supervise and make sure that vote actually counts. Because it is impossible that, you know, somebody wins an election with 93%. How do you do that? That is impossible.
Creative accounting. Creative accounting.
We have a similar issue in this country with influence in foreign powers intervening in some way, trying to influence how votes are happening. So it's a larger problem in this country as well.
But I want to pick on, I just said to repeat what she said about...
You have 30 seconds.
Okay, there's a saying, until the lion tells its own story. the story of the hunt will always glorify the hunter.
Yes.
In order, well, it was Nixon who said that in order for history to be favorable to you, you either have to write it yourself or commission someone who actually writes it. Well, I guess really, to be honest with you, time seems not to be our best ally. And on that note, on behalf of the Voice of America and the School of Communications at American University here in Washington, D.C., for hosting today's Town Hall special, Dr. Martin Luther King, A Global Vision for Justice. We thank you for watching our program live on Facebook and voaafrica.com. In the meantime, Africa, get better, not bitter, and remember to keep the African hopes alive.